The following program is made possible by the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College, CUNY.
It's pretty common these days to hear about shareholders of, say, pension funds or mutual funds making a big deal about some CEO's exorbitant pay package or a particularly lame board of directors. But how about those softer social issues? Should shareholders concern themselves with a company's environmental record or how it treats its workforce? Or is that inappropriate meddling? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining me today is Meg Voorhees from the Investor Responsibility Research Center in Washington, D.C. The IRRC is one of several groups that does background research on thorny social issues to help large shareholders decide how to cast their votes. Meg is in New York to chair a panel at a major conference on corporate accountability that Baruch College is holding. Thank you, Meg, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. My pleasure.
Let's talk a little bit about the way that shareholders can exercise some control over corporate America. What's the mechanism by which they do that?
Well, there are a number of mechanisms, but one that's perhaps most visible is by filing a shareholder resolution. And under the regulations as they are currently, and they're administered by the Securities and Exchange Commission in this country, a shareholder that owns $2,000 worth of a company's stock and has held it for a year can file a shareholder proposal. Now, you don't have to own that individually necessarily. You can form a coalition. So if you each own $100 worth of stock, you can band together until you reach that minimum level. Then there are a few other rules. You have to file it by a certain filing deadline, and it has to meet certain other criteria. But once you meet those criteria, you're in, and you can make sure that this shareholder resolution appears on the proxy statement, which is basically the agenda of the annual meeting, and other shareholders can vote on it.
And then you have to go out and campaign and try to get those votes.
You can try to campaign. It's difficult for shareholders to campaign, so that proxy statement is a public document. It's available on the SEC website before the annual meeting. It gets mailed out to all shareholders. So that's often the best way for shareholders to get their views out there. But sometimes they will call up other large investors in the company and try to persuade them to vote in favor of the proposal.
Now, your organization zeroes in on, amongst other issues, social investing. Can you tell us, can you describe what that means and tell us how strong that movement is right now?
Okay. Social investing is generally understood to encompass one or, three things, and people choose how involved they want to get. One is selecting stocks to begin with, building a portfolio that reflects your values. You can screen companies into your portfolio for certain characteristics that you find desirable, that they have good environmental stewardship, for instance. A second way is shareholder engagement. You may file shareholder resolutions. You may try to engage the company in discussion behind the scenes. And thirdly, people talk about community investing as an important pillar of social investing.
How strong is the movement today? Do you feel like it's gathering some strength?
I do think so. I mean, I kind of think of it as perhaps getting a start in about 1970 when there was a lawsuit that made its way to an appeals court in Washington, and the decision that came through was basically an order to the SEC that it reconsider the way it interpreted the shareholder proposal rule to make it easier for shareholders to file resolutions on social issues. So that was back in 1970, and so we've seen growth in the number of shareholder resolutions filed on social issues. We're also seeing I guess, a reconsideration of what's social criteria, what's financial criteria. And a lot of major investors are beginning to say that how a company manages its environmental performance, how it manages labor standards at its overseas suppliers are actually are social indicators, but they're also maybe indicators of the company's long-term shareholder value, that maybe a company who thinks ahead on these issues is less likely to be hurt by bad publicity further down the road or by lawsuits.
What are some of the hot topics right now in this field? What are some of the resolutions that you're seeing filed?
Okay, well, this has been a record year for shareholder resolutions of all kinds. At IRRC, we know of more than 1,100 shareholder resolutions that have been filed at U.S. companies on the broad range of subjects, corporate governance, corporate social responsibility. So that's an all-time record. The number of shareholder proposals dealing with social issues specifically is also at an all-time record. 340 have been filed this year. And some of the leading issues are the environment. There have been about 57 proposals filed on environmental issues, and about half of those have been asking companies in one way or another about climate change issues. Have they measured their greenhouse gas emissions? Are they attempting to reduce them? Will they disclose their greenhouse gas emissions? Or asking for the board, a committee of the board of directors, to do a substantive review of how the company might be affected, not just by the physical effects of climate change, but also by climate change regulation that may come into effect.
And besides the environment, are there other major categories?
Sure. One area that's been interesting is there's been a surge of proposals asking companies to formally pledge not to discriminate on the basis of employee sexual orientation. And that has really gained a great deal of acceptability in the business world and in the investor community. So, you know, the majority of the Fortune 100 companies, for instance, now have such policies, and we've also seen that on the investor side, when investors see these proposals, they're more likely to support them. We've seen vote levels for those proposals rising over the years. This year, 24 proposals were filed at companies on this issue, and all but 3 were withdrawn by the proponents after they met with the companies and the companies agreed to revise their EEO policies to include the word sexual orientation.
So sometimes it can really just be leverage to get the companies to make changes, and they don't necessarily have to go through with the votes themselves.
That's correct. And often shareholder activists will say that they file shareholder resolutions as a last resort. If they can't get the company to return their calls, they may end up filing a shareholder resolution to get their attention.
What about labor unions? Are you seeing very many proposals coming from them in the social issues area?
The trade unions have been very active on the corporate governance front in recent years.
I'm thinking of employee benefits, that kind of thing.
Right. They've been very active in the last few years looking at executive pay issues, and this year they filed a proposal calling for a common sense executive pay plan. So they've been very active in that area. They haven't been as active looking at social issues. This year, as an exception, 2 unions in particular, the Service Employees International Union and the Central Laborers Pension Fund, have filed about 24 proposals at a range of companies asking them to disclose in detail their political contributions, to actually itemize them and to explain what was the rationale for each of these contributions, who at the company is responsible for making the decisions. And I think there's concern by the unions that managers could be making some of these political contributions kind of on a whim and not track very closely what happens to that money.
Well, do you find that people are getting concerned at all that with all of this input on the environment and on someone's sexual preferences and on political contributions, that we've sort of lost sight of the idea that companies are trying to create shareholder value and wealth for their shareholders? I mean, Is there any concern about mixing these two things up too much?
I think that most of the proponents we are following would say that the issues that they are promoting are not antithetical at all to good business performance, that they're shareholders. They want the company to do well. And often they get involved because they are worried about the company's financial performance, or they think the company's performance is fine right now, but it needs to be thinking ahead. Has it thought about if it's expanding overseas and has operations in China? Has it thought about what the labor standards are like? Has it thought about how to make sure that labor standards are meeting international standards? And if it is, if it's taking the time to put those processes in place for implementation and monitoring, then it's far less likely it's going to run into a situation where we hear some horror story about a factory.
But I mean, it sounds nice in theory, but I'm just thinking, if I'm a CEO and I'm trying to make decisions, do I really want to be paying attention to, oh, there might be a resolution by this or that church group or environmental group, and it sort of clouds their judgment potentially, no?
Well, I suppose that's one advantage of the U.S. system. There's a healthy debate. It's a free market also for ideas. So, and often shareholders find that they don't win right away. It takes a while for an idea to gain currency. And certainly, the question of sexual orientation and discrimination, that's an issue that's kind of built over the last few years, and U.S. society has moved quite a bit on this front, and we're seeing that reflected in corporate policies.
But how do you decide what is an appropriate social issue to raise at the corporate level? I mean, who makes that judgment?
Well, each investor advocate would be somewhat different. Some investors have a certain mission. They're faith-based investors, they're religious institutions, so they're trying to invest in line with their values. Pension funds, public pension funds, often have a concern about labor issues because they're representing employees, and so that's in part their mission. So you'll see those values raised by various proponents.
We'll be right back, Meg.
Okay, thank you.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Meg Voorhees from the Investor Responsibility Research Center in Washington, D.C. How successful have some of these initiatives been in actually getting corporations to change?
Okay, well, we discussed the campaign on sexual orientation, anti-discrimination policies. That's been quite successful. In fact, there was a proposal this year at Fifth Third Bank Corp, which is based in Cincinnati. Cincinnati is the one city in the United States that specifically prohibits any sort of protected status on the basis of sexual orientation for city employees. It's been a concern to a number of the the companies in that city, and they've been trying to get that charter repealed. Fifth Third Bank Corp has not been active in that debate, and it found itself the recipient of one of these proposals, and interestingly, it decided not to take a position in its proxy statement. Typically, management recommends a vote against the shareholder proposal. At this time, it said it simply had no position, and that proposal was supported by nearly 63% of the shares voted. So that was a very clear-cut gain for the proponents. So clearly, there's a lot of shareholders in the company who share the proponents' views. Another issue, I think, is concerns about global climate change. this season, a number of prominent energy companies have agreed to institute high-level reviews of their climate change policies, how they could be affected by climate change, to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, and report that to shareholders. So we've seen a number of those proposals get withdrawn. For a number of the proposals that have actually come to vote so far, we're also seeing pretty high vote levels. I just saw some vote results yesterday, and we're talking about support levels in the range of 27%, 28%, 37% at these oil and gas companies. So
now that doesn't sound like a lot.
It may not sound like a lot if you haven't followed this issue,
right.
But yes, these are clearly not passing resolutions, but it's certainly, my experience has been that does get management's attention when you have, more than a quarter of the shares being voted in favor of a proposal. I think that sends a signal. Yeah.
Right. Is there much evidence that if you pursue good social policies that you will generate good returns for shareholders? Is there a tight linkage there or not really?
I feel like this is where the academic community can probably answer better than I. I know there's all sorts of sophisticated studies out there to analyze investment return and investment styles. But certainly we hear from the socially responsible investing community that there's no longer a penalty, that
but there
investment
was a
managers. Well, I think if we go back to the early days of the socially responsible investing movement, if we go back to the 1980s, a lot of it was divest from companies doing business in South Africa. And so you had, at one point, 200 to 300 prominent U.S. companies that were involved in South Africa across a whole range of industries. So that is a pretty restrictive investment policy.
And the people that, my recollection of that time is that people who invested in socially responsible mutual funds, for example, did not do as well as the overall market.
That's correct. But I think those mutual fund managers were saying we're doing a whole lot better now. The Morningstar ratings indicate that there's always a number of SRI managed mutual funds that do well, that get their top scores. And a lot of SRI managers are now taking a best-in-class approach. They try to have a diversified portfolio. Let's pick the best oil and gas companies in that sector. Let's pick the best chemical companies in the sector rather than trying to not invest at all in a sector that is going to have a larger environmental footprint.
I think where it gets tricky, I certainly understand with church groups, for example, that they would want their funds invested in ways that are consistent with their values, and labor unions that they will be pursuing companies where they feel that the policies are not pro-union. Where I think it gets very murky is with public pension funds, where the only defining characteristic of the investor is the fact that they're a public employee. They may have no political concerns, or they may have many. How do public pension fund managers justify a decision to pursue social investing, potentially putting some of the investment returns at risk, since there's no really, you can't really sit there and tell me that they're going to do as well as the overall market. So how can they justify that?
Well, the public pension funds public pension funds in general tend not to engage in screening as much as other funds, but I think there have been legal opinions issued, for instance, by the Department of Labor that provide some, protection to investment managers who are considering social criteria as a long-term financial indicator. So that if they are making the investment decisions in good faith and trying to maintain and improve the returns to beneficiaries, they should not be in any legal difficulty.
But that gives them legal protection. It doesn't necessarily make it right for the shareholder, for the investor in that public pension fund, right? It's what you're looking for is not a legal decision that says, yes, you won't get sued if you do this, but is it the right thing to do? If I'm a public employee, is it right that the pension fund manager is imposing a social agenda on my retirement funds?
Well, I think it probably varies with each pension fund. The California pension funds have a board of trustees that represent various constituencies, and so they hammer out some policies. So presumably that is somewhat reflective because of the way that board of trustees is constituted.
Is there any effort to control the investing in places where there are conflicts, for example, in the Middle East? Would that fall under the rubric of social investing?
I think it would fall under the rubric of social investing. I haven't run across it that much. There was a proposal this year at Caterpillar expressing concern about the way its equipment was being used by the Israeli Defense Forces. Caterpillar provides these tractors, and they're just gargantuan tractors, and then they're not designed as military equipment, but they're sold to Israel through the Defense Department Foreign Procurement Program, and then Israel, beefs them up and armor plates them, and these are the tractors that are bulldozers that are going in and bulldozing homes, various locations in Palestine. So so there was a resolution about this year. I don't think it did very well. I think what I heard preliminary reports is that it got maybe 4% support. But it's also the first time this issue was raised, and it raises kind of tricky issues. Caterpillar's not selling directly to Israel. Is this a question that the company should be considering? Is this a question for U.S. lawmakers to be considering? What should our policy be in the Middle East?
So in some respects, this movement could start to venture into foreign policy issues as well.
I think that's often a question that investors have to consider as they're voting on shareholder resolutions. Is this an appropriate question to raise before an individual company, or is this something where this raises a larger regulatory or public policy issue, and we really want U.S. lawmakers engaged? When you ask that question about what's driving socially responsible investing, I think maybe one reason is that we're in kind of a almost an anti-regulatory environment right now. For many years, there's been a reluctance to impose new environmental regulations. So we often see shareholder resolutions and shareholder activism kind of trying to fill that gap.
Oh, that's interesting. So if indeed Congress were to become more assertive in some of these areas, you think you might see a decline in shareholder resolutions?
Possibly. South Africa was an interesting example where, there was great concern about this minority regime and the human rights abuses in South Africa, and yet U.S. foreign policy towards South Africa was still, quite warm. There were strong ties, and there were only very minor sanctions against South Africa in the early days. So I think there was, we saw the divestment movement arise in a way because I think there was frustration that not enough was happening at the U.S. foreign policy level.
So we could start to think about shareholder resolutions as the leading edge of political reform in this country.
Well, I think often that's what shareholder resolutions are. For a number of years, we've seen resolutions at pharmaceutical companies asking them, and these are often from religious investors who maybe are operating hospitals. So they see firsthand what high drug prices do to their patients. They're released from the hospital and they need to maintain a certain drug regimen, and it's hard for them. So there have been proposals for a number of years asking drug companies to exercise restraint on their prices. And you would think if for other investors who are voting on this, what's your interest in voting for this proposal? Shouldn't the company try to get good prices for its product? Well, we can kind of see that as a leading issue. I mean, there's been all sorts of discussion about drug prices. It's in the news. We're seeing senators saying, well, maybe we should be importing drugs from Canada. So often I look upon shareholder resolutions as maybe an early warning that there's something afoot out there.
That's interesting. Well, I think this whole discussion of when is it appropriate to have financial concerns, when the social concerns, how do you mix those two together, what happens, has been very, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've been very fortunate to have Meg Voorhees from the Investor Responsibility Research Center on the show today. We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
If you can earn good financial returns on your investments and at the same time do social good, why wouldn't you? That, in essence, is the argument of money managers who promote so-called social investing. But life is rarely that black and white. What if, in hiring only union labor or reducing greenhouse emissions, the companies you invest in earn less than a broadly based index fund you could have owned? Even worse, what if you didn't know your pension fund manager had that agenda for your retirement savings? These are only some of the difficult issues that the new movement towards social investing poses. I have no quarrel with mutual funds that explicitly market themselves as socially responsible investment vehicles. I know up front what I'm getting into, and I can choose to put some or all of my money into those funds. But just because I'm a union member or a public employee doesn't necessarily mean I want my pension fund manager to apply his or her standards of social justice to my retirement funds. Until there's better data to support the theory that you can do well by doing good, social investing should be a matter of individual choice. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.